Pretty much ready. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, and it's great to have such a wonderful crowd. I'm Colleen Feige. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Edina, and thank you all for coming out. And I know the Vikings are playing tonight, but we don't have any feed on that information. But what we do have is a wonderful speakers to tell us about what internment is like. Sally Sudo is the speaker, and she is also the recipient of the Edina Tom Oy Human Relations Award in 2022, I believe it was. So she's lived through a lot of things that a lot of us have heard about, but haven't experienced. And unfortunately, incarceration without due process is occurring a little more these days. So it's kind of coming back, unfortunately. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sally Sudo and her son, Rich. Okay, go ahead.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for having me today. Especially appreciate those of you who were willing to give up the Vikings game to come here. I will be kind of doing a co-presentation with my son, Richard. Rich is a recently retired from teaching for 35 years in the Minneapolis Public Schools. I told him, as I'm getting on in years, that I know that there will come a time when I would like him to be able to take over and do this, because I think our story is an important one, and yet it's really not written up very much in the history books. But we do see kind of remnants of what happened to us happening again under this present administration. So I think we always have to be mindful that, misguided policies by our government can affect innocent people and ruin lives. And I think in a country like America, no one should have to be placed in prison unless they've committed a crime and been charged, had a trial, been found guilty. And then, to me, that's the right process. And yet, 125,284 of us were put in a prison camp during World War II, and really, our only crime was our ethnicity, our nationality. Just because we were at war with Japan, the government reasoned, well, Japan is our enemy. The Japanese Americans living in our country are probably enemies as well. And so many of them live on the West Coast. To hear conspiracy theories, you would think that when people like my parents came over, by the way, my dad came over in 1899, and my mother in 1917. They had been here for decades. But to hear conspiracy theorists talk about it, you would think that they came here and deliberately settled on the West Coast, so they would be there in case Japan ever started a war with America, and then they would be ready to jump in and help their, parents' country. To me, I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's how people's minds work. I wanted to say something about the title of my presentation, Life in an American Concentration Camp. A lot of people call it an internment camp, but really that is the incorrect term. There is a difference between a concentration camp and an internment camp. So, in internment camps, they're used to detain enemy aliens during a time of war. Internment camps are run by the Department of Justice, and only an immigrant can be placed in an internment camp. Since 2/3 of us were American citizens, it would have been against the law to put us in an internment camp. And that's why they had to build special camps to keep us incarcerated. Now, a concentration camp is a guarded compound where ethnic or religious minorities are confined for political reasons. So you see, what happened to us checks all the boxes. But people really do not like my using that term because it conjures up memories of the concentration camps in Germany. And I want you to know that our camps were nothing like the German concentration camps. To me, those were extermination camps. But the fact that we were really imprisoned only because of our nationality, and it was for political reasons.
Okay.
So my son is going to tell you a little bit about the background of my parents who came to this country.
I have my own mic. Thanks. My name is Rich Sudo. I am Sally's son. I'm mostly here to drive my mom here to make sure she gets here safely. If I don't, she threatens to drive herself, which is not good. So I've driven her to a number of these things. I've watched her do the speech over several decades. And now she's finally letting me do a few of the slides. So I'm still in the trainee mode, and so I appreciate your patience tonight. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the attitudes leading up to World War II, what it was like in terms of citizenship, what it was like in terms of immigration. So going all the way back to the beginning, in 1790, there was the Naturalization Act of 1790, where they first defined citizenship or new citizens as being those of that aliens being a free white person. I think that eliminated people that were indentured servants, and I'm not sure how they defined white, but they had to live within the United States for at least 2 years to become eligible for citizens. And then jumping ahead, after the Civil War, so jumping ahead 100 years, there was a question of, well, what about the slaves? What were the African Americans who were freed? What was it going to be their status? And so the 14th Amendment was passed that defined anybody who was born as a citizen. So that's where they established birthright citizenship. This is 100 years after the founding of our country. It also established that any state cannot deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process. So that became an important thing that happened in 1868. In 1882, this is after a number of Chinese workers had come to the country to, during the gold rush, to build the railroads. There was a large number of Chinese immigrants who were workers on the West Coast in particular, and there started to become, there was like race riots in San Francisco and so forth. There was a Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882. This was the first federal legislation to suspend immigration for a specific nationality. This is now leading up to the time to when my grandfather arrived in the United States in 1899, so right before that, they established Ellis Island as the primary immigration station for the United States. Now, the reason why this was important, because, of course, Ellis Island is on the East Coast. Most of the people coming from Asia would land in the West Coast. And so that was the place that you went to, where most of the immigrants were allowed to come through. And it specifically allowed white persons and their children from Western European countries to become citizens. There was not just Europe, but specific countries in Europe. around this time, this is from April 2nd of 1905, so just 6 years after my grandfather arrived in the United States. This is from the San Francisco Chronicle. I put this in here because it says Japs bring frightful disease, and there's a picture of an immigration officer poking in somebody's eyeball there. It reminded me a little bit of the story we heard about, they're eating their pets and stuff like that. This is one of the ways that they use the media to dehumanize, in this case, Japanese people, to make them, suspect. My grandmother arrived in 1917, and right soon after that, there was something called the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924. It banned immigration from all Asian countries. So she got in just under the wire. It prioritized immigration from Northern and Western Europe. And you can see this is a picture from the New York Times, interestingly, from page 181 of the New York Times on April 27th. So the shocking part about that is there were 181 pages in the newspaper. I looked it up, and it was a Sunday, so Sunday New York Times is a little bit thicker. And you can see on the left side, there's a map of all the countries where the largest number of immigrants are coming from. There in the darkened color, and the new immigration laws, you can see, limited that immigration to mostly countries and in Western Europe, in particular England, and it looks like Germany. Okay. This lasted until the Immigration Naturalization Act of 1965. So that was a long period of time in which this kind of immigration law was under effect. Right around the time right around the time before World War II came to the United States, before Pearl Harbor, I looked this up. This came from a newspaper in New York City. It was the afternoon edition called the PM. And this was noted as a particularly kind of liberal newspaper. In this newspaper, there was a political cartoonist named Theodore Geisel who began publishing his political cartoons. This is one of his political cartoons here where he shows this guy playing the piano, and he's only playing the white keys. And the guy says, Uncle Sam says, if you want real harmony, use the black keys as well as the white. So it was advocating for more integration in the workforce. Well, the same Theodore Geisel, after Pearl Harbor, published this cartoon. You can see a bunch of Japanese Americans here lined up being handed boxes of TNT by this guy here in this little shack. It says, waiting for the signal for home. And then here's another one where it says that maybe only alley cats, but jeepers, there's a hell of a lot of them, sort of comparing Japanese Americans to alley cats, and you had to, they were a nuisance. Well, anybody know who this is, Theodore Geisel? Some of you probably recognize. Yes, this is Dr. Seuss. And so when I first heard this, it kind of shocked me because, I love Dr. Seuss. I read Dr. Seuss to my kids. We would watch, How the Grinch Stole Christmas and everything. And so what really struck me about this was how acceptable it was for everybody to adopt this attitude. It was just normal, right? Even the so-called liberal newspapers were fully on board with this. All right, so that brings us up to Pearl Harbor, and I'm going to hand it back to my mom. Oh,
okay. All right. So Pearl Harbor happened on a Sunday, December 7th, and most of our family were in church at the local Seattle Japanese Baptist Church. That is all except for my teenage brother, 14-year-old Tom. He was at the movies instead. And they were showing the film The Maltese Falcon with Humphrey Bogart. And he said all of a sudden a scroll came across the screen saying, all military personnel report to your bases immediately. And people kind of started looking around, wondering what was happening. And it was after the film ended that the manager came into the lobby and told everybody that they had learned that Pearl Harbor had been bombed, and they weren't sure what to expect next. So it would be safest if everybody just quietly went back to their homes. And so my brother being the only Asian face in that crowd, everybody started pointing at him. Oh, there's a Jap, let's get him. So he ran as fast as he could to get back home, fortunately without getting hurt. But of course, my mother had no sympathy for him because he should have been in church, like the rest of us. Yes. So then this map shows you where the Japanese population was living according to the 1940 census. And you can see that the large portion of them are on the West Coast, with Washington having over 14,000, over 4,000 in Oregon, and over 93,000 in California. Here in our state of Minnesota, there are only 51 in the whole state. And most of those were those that work for the Great Northern Railroad, because this was one of the stations for that train line. And so this large concentration of Japanese on the West Coast, of course, when you think back in those days, they came over by ship. And the first place they would land, if they weren't going to stop in Hawaii, would be the West Coast of our country. And not only that, that they found that the climate was, with more or less what they were used to in Japan. And also there was good farmland, with many of them being farmers. And then living on the coast, a lot of them were also fishermen. So this is why they decided to settle on the West Coast. This is my very large family growing up in Seattle, Washington. I am next to the youngest of 10 children, 4 boys, 6 girls. And we lived in an area in Seattle, which today is called the International District. Back then it was known as Nihon Machi. Nihon Machi means Japantown. So there were very many businesses and shops and so on owned by the Japanese. In the beginning, we weren't sure exactly how many of us ended up being rounded up and put in these prison camps. The government always estimated it was somewhere between 110 to 120,000. And it wasn't until, I think it was 3 years ago, that a Buddhist priest in California got a grant to do the research. And he then recorded every name according to the date of birth, so there wouldn't be any duplications of those that were incarcerated in one of these camps. And that's how they came up with that number of 125,284. What families have been doing, because this book, it may have traveled to another destination now, but for the first few years, it was kept at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. And so families will go out there, look through the book for the family names, and then they would put a little stamp after that name. In Japan, for official documents, you don't only just sign your name, but each family has a rubber stamp with their family name on it that they use to stamp documents as well. And so this is my nephew Brian, who's here listening today, stamping the names of the people in our family. Just to kind of validate, yes, we actually were in one of those camps. Within 48 hours, close to 1,300 Issei are the immigrant generation. They were picked up by the FBI and taken off without any charges and put in various Department of Justice prisons. Mainly, they were people that were considered leaders in our community, people that might have been Japanese language teachers, editors of Japanese language newspapers, prominent business people, and a large portion of them were Buddhist priests. The government felt Buddhism is not an American religion, therefore it must be an enemy religion, and if you're a Buddhist, you probably can be considered an enemy. And so that's, amongst those that were rounded up was my father's cousin. Mr. Yamashita ended up being sent to a prison camp in Bismarck, North Dakota, called Fort Lincoln. And the only reason he was captured was because actually he had a law degree from the University of Washington, but he was not allowed to practice law because he was not a citizen. I don't know if you're aware that Asians in America could not even apply to become a naturalized citizen until 1952. And that is the only exception were the Filipinos, because there was this, the Philippines were a treaty, rather a territory of the United States at that time. So people of my father's cousin had this law degree, couldn't practice law, so he decided to become a strawberry farmer in the little town of Bremerton, Washington. And on his strawberry farm, he had dynamite because the field that he got was so full of tree stumps. He used the dynamite, to blow up the tree stumps. But because they found dynamite, they thought he was guilty, and they took him, arrested him, sent him up to Bismarck, North Dakota, and for months, his family had no idea whether he was dead or alive or where he even was. So then the FBI also came through all of our homes, and they took away things they considered contraband. Now, to them, contraband was if you had a shortwave radio. They took away our cameras, our binoculars, any kind of telescopes, things like that. And my parents were so worried when they heard of, other families running into problems that they burned anything that they had in their home in the Japanese language, which meant the letters from their relatives back in Japan, books that they may have had in the Japanese language, even Japanese music on records.
All right, so I've often wondered, so my mother at the time was 6 years old, and she said she was the second youngest of 10. So, I've always sort of been interested in, well, what did my older aunts and aunts think at the time? And thinking back, the subject never came up at family gatherings. They were reluctant to talk about it. Even when I have talked to some of them, they would mostly tell me facts that I could read in a history book. They would not really talk about how they felt at the time. It was very difficult for them, I would imagine. So what I tried to do is I looked at, there's a website called Densho, where they had, I think it was maybe 20 years ago or so, somebody took the effort to record the testimonies of people like my mother. You can find her story on this website as well, where they just sat and told their story to the camera, and what happened to them, what happened to their family, and so forth. And so I tried to look up some people who were in Seattle at the time that my mother's family was there. And I looked up people who were older, like in their teens or maybe young adults at the time. What were their experiences like? And so I found a few of those I'd like to share. So this woman is named Sharon Takagi, and she was 16 years old on the day of Pearl Harbor. Now, the FBI came to, when the FBI came and took somebody, a friend of the family, their family got very concerned about this. And she vividly remembers the family gathering their things together and burning things in the backyard. They made a bonfire and they started burning things. And like my mother said, these were family keepsakes. Letters from relatives who, they're separated by an ocean. This is the only contact they've had with them. They had to burn those things. Family pictures, things with Japanese writing. These things were all burned. She says, I helped stoke the fire. We were throwing in books, everything we could. This family here, there's 3 siblings. The youngest, who I think his name is Joe, he was only 9 years old. He was born in the United States. But the older 2 siblings were 18 and 19, and they had been born in Japan. So their father happened to be the head of something called a Kenjinkai, which is like, imagine if you went to live in a foreign country. Let's say you moved to Brazil or somewhere. You didn't speak the language. You didn't know anybody, but you came there, you left everything behind, and you were there to establish a new life. And then imagine if there was a group of people from Minnesota who were already living there. Some of them had businesses, and they kind of helped welcome newcomers. They would help them find a place to live, maybe hook them up with a job and so forth, kind of show them the ropes of how to get around town and things like that. That's what this organization was. It was for a local region of Japan. They had their own little sort of Chamber of Commerce type group. Their father was the head of that group, and so on the day of Pearl Harbor, the FBI came to their house, and they were the only ones home. Mom was out at church or something, and Dad was out doing something, and so the FBI came in and started questioning the kids, and they started going through all their things. Now, the oldest was at the University of Washington, and he was in the ROTC, so he had his uniform in the closet. And the FBI says, why do you have this uniform? They immediately found it suspicious. And he said, well, I'm in the ROTC. And so they took the uniform from him, and he said, I'm going to need that back because I had to pay a deposit on that thing. If I don't get it back, I'm going to lose my deposit. Well, he never got it back. The mom comes home while the FBI is there, and she's saying, who are these people? Who are these people? She's speaking in Japanese, and the FBI starts yelling at her, don't speak in Japanese, right? She can't speak English, so there's all this, they're trying to explain to them, well, my mother doesn't speak Japanese, and she's trying to figure out, she doesn't speak English, trying to figure out what's going on. They find out that the 2 older siblings are not U.S. citizens, and they say, why aren't you U.S. citizens? And the oldest one is kind of dumbstruck. He goes, well, I'm not allowed to become a U.S. citizen. The FBI didn't even know. They found that suspicious that they didn't choose to be U.S. citizens, apparently, but they weren't allowed to. It turns out the older one, who was in the ROTC, later ends up serving in the U.S. Army in Italy and eventually becomes a Bronze Star winner for his service in, I think it was the Netherlands or someplace like that, eventually. But anyways, this is the kind of thing that's going on. Because their father was head of this organization, people are calling the house because they want to know what's going on. What are we supposed to do? And all these conversations are in Japanese. So mom is answering the phone. She's answering in Japanese. The FBI is yelling at her, don't speak in Japanese. It's very chaotic. Okay.
So then finally on February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt signs an executive order, 9066. And what this executive order actually does is it divides the country into 4 military zones. And a military general is put in charge of each zone. So we were living, as I said, in Seattle at that time. So we fell under the Western Defense Command under Lieutenant General John DeWitt. Now, we're at war with Italy and Germany as well. And I think probably distance-wise, they're closer to our country, mileage-wise, than Japan is to the West Coast, right? And yet, the general in charge of the Eastern Defense Zone, he knows enough to leave well enough alone. But the problem is that Lieutenant John DeWitt has a very racist attitude. The Japanese race is an enemy race. You needn't worry about the Italians at all, except in certain cases. Also the same for the Germans, except in individual cases. But you must worry about the Japanese all the time until he's wiped off the face of the map. A Jap is a Jap, and that's all there is to it. So to him, it made no difference whether we were born in America and had been raised as American citizens. As long as we had that Japanese face, we were an enemy, no better than the Japanese who lived in their own country. This is a picture from a San Francisco Chronicle of a mother at the bedside of her 21-year-old son. Now, he is half Japanese. In other words, the mother's Japanese, the father's Caucasian. And when he finds out that he's going to have to go off to one of these prison camps, he tries to commit suicide. You only had to be 1/16th part Japanese for the executive order to apply to you. That way they were trying to make sure they got anybody who had any Japanese blood in them. We often wondered where the government even found where all of us were living. Well, in our case, it was easy because we were in a segregated neighborhood. But, we had relatives who lived on farms away from the city. How did the government know, where they were? Because they actually got their orders in the mail. And as it turned out, it was years later that we learned that the government illegally used the 1940 census to locate everybody. Because in those days, when they did the census, you didn't declare that you were like an Asian or Pacific Islander. Everything was listed by nationality. So it would say like Korean, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino. All those were listed, and of course your address would be part of the census. So this is how they were able to locate all the people that they wanted removed. Now here is part of the business district of Nihonmachi, that Japanese area of Seattle that I told you about. You can see it's a very thriving area. And then this is what it's like after people then had to leave. In many cases, they were only given a few weeks' notice. And with that, there's hardly any way you're going to be able to sell off your business or your property. And therefore, people took tremendous losses to their personal belongings and to their businesses. I think on your brochure it said something like $1.6 billion or something like that. Well, I'm wondering if that was the figure back in the 40s, because we're told that in today's economy, it would have been more like $8 to $10 billion worth of losses that people suffered.
All right, so this is a story of Art Abe and what happened to his family. He was 20 years old on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack, and his family owned just a local grocery store. Because they were a family-owned grocery store at the time, they were a little bit more informal than he compares them to the chain grocery store A&P and Safeway that were also nearby. He said that at his family grocery store, they allowed customers to buy on credit. So people would come get their groceries, they would ring them up, but they wouldn't pay that day. They would come and pay every month. And that's sort of what attracted customers to their grocery store, as opposed to some of the other stores where you could not do that. As soon as Pearl Harbor happened, people stopped coming. So customers did not come. And they all had outstanding bills. So he remembers going with his father to go around town trying to collect what was owed to them as they were going to get removed from the city. And they were unsuccessful. They got very few of the accounts settled. So they lost a tremendous amount of money. They also were trying to sell their store, and they couldn't get anybody to buy it. They had a store full of groceries. They tried to talk the jewelry store owner across the street into buying their store, but he couldn't afford it. And so in order to maybe bring the price down, they tried to sell off their inventory to make the price of the store cheaper. And so they started selling whatever groceries they had left over at below market prices. The A&P and the Safeway complained that they were being undercut and that it was illegal. So they filed a complaint, and they had to stop doing that. And so they ended up having all this unsold inventory that they had to take a loss on. So it was sort of like damned if you did, damned if you didn't kind of situation. He did say that later, when they were initially moved to a camp, there was a camp that they initially were moved to before they got sent away, that one of their customers did track them down, came all the way to the camp, and actually paid them through the barbed wire. So he does remember that one thing, and he appreciated that family.
So shortly after Pearl Harbor, we were asked to send a family representative to what was called a civil control station. And there, each family had to register and name all the members of their family. And then they were issued these ID tags, and each family was given a family number. Now, this is just a replica of what those tags were like. But then they were worn on your person, and whenever you were moved from place to place, at least, you know, the others would know which families all belonged together, and at least they could keep little babies from being separated from their parents and so on. And so we became family number 11872. Of course, we had to all be vaccinated for all the communicable diseases. And then anybody who was 14 years and older had to be fingerprinted. Now, the first place that we were sent was to where the fairgrounds was in the Seattle area, near this town called Puyallup, Washington. Because, you know, the government is telling the general population that we're too dangerous to be left at large. And yet, where are they going to confine us? Nothing has been, you know, made ready yet. And so in most cases, they use places like the fairgrounds, because when you think about it, there's all these empty buildings, there's running water, there's bathrooms, right? And in some cases, they use what they call exposition halls, where livestock were kept.
So when you first got to the camp, one of the things you had to do, so this again goes back to the story of Sharon Takagi. Again, she was 16 on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack. She was the one who remembers the family burning all their materials and so forth. And she said all through this time, she never saw her mother cry until they got to this Camp Puyallup. And they were told to get this burlap sack, and they had to stuff it with straw. Each person had to stuff their own sack with straw to use as a mattress. And at that point, her mother broke down, and that's the first time she saw her mother cry.
One of my most vivid memories of the time being in Puyallup was one day when the principal of my elementary school came with boxes and boxes of chocolates. And she stood there on one side of the barbed wire fence, and we were all on the other side, and she was handing out the candy to all the kids that, were in her school with just tears running down her cheeks. Her name was Betsy Mahon.
So when I first heard this story from my mother, it really struck me, and I looked for more information about it, and I found out there was a person named Sat Ichikawa who wrote a children's book where he also remembers this same incident, and this is from his children's book, the picture and the text telling the exact same story, where the principal came down, was handing out candy, and the PE teacher was there giving out basketballs to the kids to play. I also emailed the school, Bailey Gatzert Elementary School in Seattle. It's still there. I emailed the current principal, and he was able to find an old picture, an old class photo with Miss Mahon's picture in it. So there she is. She's I think she's in the back row of that picture, and I tried to zoom in and circle her face right there. There's Miss Mahon of Bailey Gatzert School. Now, Sharon Takagi, she remembers Miss Mahon as well. She was in middle school, and she says she remembers that at Bailey Gatzert, when they went into the auditorium, they would march to like patriotic music, like Stars and Stripes Forever and everything. And citizenship was a big deal for Miss Mahon. They had an after-school citizens club where they talked about what it meant to be an American citizen. This was sort of a theme of her elementary school, instilling because most of her students were immigrants, she wanted to let them know that if you're American citizens, these are your rights, this is what it means to be an American citizen. And so for Principal Mahon, it must have been particularly galling that all these things that she had been teaching her kids were being betrayed. And so she remembers Miss Mahon not from visiting the camp, but when she was being loaded onto the bus to be sent to camp, Miss Mahon was there shaking the hands of all the kids and all the families, and she was telling them how sorry she was at the time. Okay.
This map then shows you where the 10 permanent camps were being built over the summer of 1942. You see that in California, there's Tule Lake on the northern border near Oregon, and then there's Manzanar, and in Arizona, there's Poston and Gila River. Our family was sent to the one in Idaho called Minidoka. In addition, there's Hart Mountain in Wyoming, Topaz, Utah, and Grenada in Colorado, although we call that Camp Amachi. And then there are 2 of them over here in Arkansas along the Mississippi River. So these were the 10 camps then that housed the bulk of the incarcerated people. But when Reverend Duncan Williams did that research of finding all those names of who was incarcerated, he did learn that there were actually 75 confinement sites. So besides these main camps, there were probably other, I know that he probably counted the Department of Justice prison camps, and then there may have been county jails that, also incarcerated people. And then even in Hawaii, they had about 10 or 12 prison camps. There they did not take all the population of the Japanese Americans, because that would have ruined their economy, because they estimated about 35% of the population were of Japanese descent. So instead, it was mainly men and boys 14 years and older. And then in case a family wanted to stay intact, then they would go along with the father and, the son. So this is Minidoka. As you can see, it's really in a very dry, desert-like area. There were 44 blocks of these tar-papered barracks. And very muddy, dirty ground. This is a map of the layout of our camp, and our family ended up here in Block 14, where you see the blue arrow. And then in the lower right-hand corner, you see how the blocks are built, kind of like in the letter H shape. Barracks on two sides, the mess hall, which is a rectangular building in the middle, and then the building that's shaped like the letter H would be the sanitation building. Men on one side and women on the other. The way these individual camps, in all 10 camps, were built in the same style. This was patterned after the German camps in Germany. You also see on the northeastern side, these are names of all these vegetables, because many of the men, being farmers, learned to use the water from the canal on the south side to irrigate the fields on the north, and they started growing their own vegetables. They petitioned the government for the seeds and all, and also they asked the government if they could supply chickens. And there were a lot of rabbits in the desert that they would capture, and so this is kind of what they also used for, to have meat, was rabbits and the chicken. And of course, the chicken provided the eggs as well. So this is a picture of the block that I was in, and that's me in the red circle. So I was there from age 6 until I turned almost 10, so 3.5 years. This is what the inside of our barracks look like. They're really not finished buildings. I mean, if you have to build enough construction for 125,000 people and you've only got one summer to do it, they're not going to be very nice buildings. And so in most cases, these buildings had no ceiling. They had only, the only electricity we had was a pull-down chain light bulb from the rafters. And then we had these kind of beds that we used our straw mattresses on. And then each room had a pot-bellied stove, and you were allowed to have 1 bucket of coal a day during the winter, but it got as cold as 20 below in the winter and as hot as 110 degrees in the summer. That's what the conditions were like. So in the winter, we had to really put on all our coats and everything, because the rooms were always cold enough that if you had standing water, the water would freeze. Now, the worst thing, of course, was the sanitation conditions. Here you see the showers, how close together the spigots are. And this is a picture of my sister, who was 16 years old at the time. The reason I put her picture in here is because out of all of our 10 children, she was the one that, for some reason, was psychologically affected the most. And she ended up having a nervous breakdown. So it was having to shower like this, she was very self-conscious about that. And then toilets that don't have any stalls. So they're just all open rows of toilets. It really is dehumanizing, and it does affect you. Fortunately, I say fortunately because I think to be young enough for it not to bother me, was to my benefit. Of course, the government did not really properly provide for schooling for us. And so what the men decided to do was to set aside certain blocks for elementary school, and then they had a junior high school and high school towards the middle of the camp. But they had 2 elementary schools, one on the east end and one on the west end. And they ended up making elementary-sized furniture so that there would be something to sit on. But this is how I remember going to school, where we actually sat on the floor, and then we used these picnic-style benches for our desks. Interestingly enough, all of the teachers were Caucasian in our camp. And I think the reason for that is most of my generation were 20 years and younger. And so they had not finished their college education yet. And not only that, there really was so much discrimination at that time, especially on the West Coast, that even if you graduated with a teaching degree, very few public schools would hire you to teach. So the Japanese knew better than to go into a teaching career. So this is a picture of my first grade class. I'm in the front row, second from the right in that print dress. Eleanor Roosevelt came to visit 2 of the camps. Now, the reason she came was because people were sending letters to the editor saying that we were being coddled in the camps and that we were getting better food than people on the outside. So she thought she better go and investigate for herself. And, she used to write this column called My Day. And so she went to 2 of the camps, and she brought with her Clarence Pickett. Clarence Pickett was the head of the American Friends Service Committee. That's the Quaker group. And he came along with her because he was worried about all the college-age young people that were in these camps who knew for how long they would be there, and they were, would be wasting their life away. And he wanted to find a way to get them out of the camp and into a college. So my most vivid memories are of the sandstorms, because we're in the middle of this desert, and anytime any kind of wind picked up, the sand would just blow, and sand pelting you hurts more than getting hit by snow, because it's like little pebbles, hitting you. And then it gets all over in your hair, in your mouth, your nose. So we learned to carry a scarf around with us all the time. Whenever it got too windy, we could tie it around our mouth and nose. But then you go back to your barrack room, and everything would be covered with this fine sand. And heaven forbid, if you happened to be in the dining room, you would get the sand all over your food. Now, for my mother, in an interesting way, it was almost kind of like a little mini vacation, because for the first time in her life, she doesn't have to do any cooking, and there's very little housework for her to do. Her biggest job was doing the laundry, and she had to do it by hand, and for a family of 12, you can imagine that's a pretty big job. But for the first time in her life, she actually had time for crafts. My oldest sister was married, and her first child was born in this camp. And I remember saying to her, I just can't imagine how you coped, going back to that kind of a barrack room, no refrigerator, no running water, with a brand new baby. Okay. So there came a time then when they started asking those of our people to serve in the military. Up until then, they had been declared 4C, which means enemy alien. But then they decided that No, they need to count them, and they needed their manpower. And so they were going to start drafting them. But before they drafted them, they had to answer these, what we call the loyalty test, about whether they were willing to serve in combat wherever they were asked to serve. And then did they swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. Well, you know, that was a weird question because people in my generation never felt any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. So for them, it was kind of a slap in the face. But if you refuse to answer yes, yes to both of these, or you left them blank, you were considered disloyal, and you got to sent to a maximum security camp in Tule Lake, California. My brother Joe, who graduated from high school in the first graduating class, volunteered to serve in the military, and he was assigned to the Military Intelligence Service Language School, which had its school here at Fort Snelling. And that's then where he came. After he graduated from that school, he went on to serve in the Philippines. And his name is on this honor roll of all, these are all the ones that volunteered to serve just out of our camp alone. When the war ends, we're wondering where we're going to go. We have nothing left to go back to in Seattle. And that's when my brother Joel says, well, why don't you come here to Minnesota? Because there's many neighborhoods that didn't want the Japanese people back. And so we were given $25 each in a bus or train ticket to wherever we wanted to resettle. And so the first ones that came out here, my brother Tom, the one that was at the movies, my sister Amy, and my brother Fred. And my brother Fred bought this house for us by getting a loan from his employer for the down payment. And this house still exists in South Minneapolis on 40th Avenue South and 52nd Street, I think. And then it was finally in 1987 that the Civil Liberties Act was passed, which allowed for the government to write each of us a letter of apology for the wrongdoing that was done, and they gave any survivor $20,000. By then, my parents were no longer living, and they were the ones really that deserved that money. I'm going to save time for questions now.
All right, just in case people are interested in further information, we'll skip some of these slides. My mother does have an email where if you have questions that you think of later, she'd be willing to answer your questions if you wanted to send those in. Let's see. What else? Oh, she also recommends this book, Infamy by Richard Reeves. It's an excellent source of information on this topic. So we're going to open it up to questions. Now, I might have to repeat your questions so that people can hear. Oh, okay.
And I'll go around.
Okay, thank you.
I see a question over here. Alicia?
Is this on?
Yes, that one's on as well.
I think it's on. I just wanted to amplify one of the points that you made. I did research on this for my dissertation about 20 years ago and wrote about the concentration camps and also how it happened at the same time as the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, and many of the immigrants to the United States were from the Hiroshima area. But one of the things you said about the concentration camp, I believe at the time they were actually called concentration camps also. And it wasn't until later that the American government changed that to start calling them internment camps. And then the other thing was about the no-no boys. Many of the people, and in general, why they would say no, they could not become citizens in the United States. So they thought that if they said yes, that they would become stateless people. They would have no place in the world to go to. And so that's why a lot of people were very upset and concerned about that particular question and would put no.
Yes.
Okay. Back there's a question.
Do you by chance know, I'm pretty sure there was a woman who was in charge of the educational programs at all the camps, and there's never really been anything written about that as far as how the educational system was set up. You kind of touched on one of the teachers.
Do you know, are you thinking about a particular person?
Yeah, I looked her up years ago, but yeah, there's a particular person, but I think through marriage and maybe divorce, her name changed several times.
Do you know anything about the person who was in charge of education at all of the camps?
Who was in charge of the education in the camp?
He thinks that there was a particular person who was in charge of all the
There probably was, but I don't know that information. I'm sorry.
There's a question.
Probably can find it online.
Well, first of all, I'm not Japanese, I'm Chinese. All right. When Richard talked about having a name tag, number 118, so I was fortunate enough in 1965, I was admitted to Stanford University. At that time, there's very few Chinese students, maybe about 50 Chinese in there, most of them American born. So the local Chinese elders took me out to a street, University Avenue and Middlefield Road. So I want you to remember this. In this intersection, 6 Chinese were killed because they think that they are Japanese. So afterwards, everybody have to wear a name tag saying they're Chinese. They just seldom told it anywhere. But that was my personal story.
Was there a question?
He was telling a story of his experience. He's a Chinese gentleman. He was telling an experience where Chinese people were killed because people thought they were Japanese.
Oh, yes, that's true, yeah.
Excuse me.
So her question was, how did you go on afterwards?
How did we go on afterwards? Well, you know, for our family, none of my older siblings were allowed to go on to college. I mean, they all were very good students. And then they could have probably easily gotten scholarships to go on to college. But my parents said, I'm sorry, we need your income to support our family. And so all of them had to go off to work, and their money wasn't their own to spend. It was family money. In fact, the first person that was allowed to go straight on to college after high school was my sister Saki, who's 2 years older than I am. So it took that long for our family really to recover. And I really have to give my older siblings credit because I think they made a lot of sacrifices, giving up their own youth, really. I mean, like my brothers who should have been out dating, having fun, you know, work. My brother Fred, the one I showed you towards the end, that was one of the 3 that came here, he was the oldest boy in the family. And in the Japanese culture, an oldest boy has a particular role of being the one that has to be the caretaker for his parents. So he took that obligation very seriously. And he actually ended up working 3 jobs to get our family back on our feet. He worked a full-time job, he worked a night job, and he worked a weekend job. Now, I'm talking about at the age of like 23 or 24, you know. So I think that if it weren't for people like my older siblings, we wouldn't have been able to, you know, get through this as well.
It's a question and a comment. Well, first, this is a brief comment, but just, it's such a privilege, I know that all of us feel, to bear witness to your story. And so I just want to thank you for being here, and of course, the League and the World Without Genocide for bringing you here. And Richard, I think it's beautiful how you're partnering with your mom. I was wondering if either of you would want to talk a little bit about the 1941 Munson Report. And then I have a quick follow-up. The 1941 Munson Report.
Are familiar with the 1941 Munson report?
The 1941.
Munson.
Oh, the 1941 Munson report. Yes, I don't. I should know more about it, but I do know that in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt asked this. I think his name was Clarence Munson, to check out the situation on the West Coast. Clarence Munson was a businessman, but apparently he was kind of known in the Japanese community. So he did go through the Japanese communities on the West Coast, and he came back with a report that if you're worried about the loyalty of the Japanese people, there's nothing to worry about. They are 99% American and loyal to America. And as for that maybe 1% that wouldn't be, they can easily be identified. So in other words, he's telling the government, there's really no need to incarcerate all these people. We don't have a problem as far as that's concerned. But that report was written in 1944. I believe that it came out before Roosevelt declared this Executive Order 9066. So he kind of just ignored it. I don't think it was made public until years later. Am I right, Kelly?
Yes, and that's the basis
Right.
for why everyone got that public apology.
Right.
Because
so it was, kept from the public, and then Roosevelt went ahead anyway and declared that we all needed to be rounded up.
And I just wanted to highlight that because that's where you had said they had secretly looked at the 1940 census. That's how they were able to do this so quickly, because they already had a very in-depth secret government report looking into all of the people. And it was like, there's nothing to worry about. And I think I just want to bring this up because of the power of racism and prejudice and how that impacts public policy, because there was an actual research on these populations that found them completely fine. And I just bring this up now because I'm just thinking, just when Singh was sharing his personal story, this is obviously not the first time where we've seen remnants of this, and I'm thinking after 9/11, when folks were incarcerated, folks who were perceived to be Muslim or Middle Eastern or South Asian, and there was mass violence. And I remember, and I'm adopted Korean, and I remember I just remember talking to my white parents, and we love each other very much. Just how, and I was in college then, and we were learning about this for the first time, and just sort of seeing it happen again. And I remember him saying, if it were me, if we were at war with North Korea, for example, he would just be like, well, if you had to go for the good of the country, then you just have to go. And it just sort of like really hits home in terms of how what's happening is not based on evidence. What happened in 1942 was not based on actual evidence. And that's what's found in terms of like a lot of, obviously, the things that happened with 9/11. And we can all point to other points in history when it's racialized like this. I'm thinking of Wen Ho Lee, for example, in 1991. There are so many instances, and you just see a lot of remnants. And so, sorry, I'm just like really thankful for you to bringing the story, but that's why I wanted to bring up the Munson report, because sometimes people still try to justify things for the good of the country, but it's based on prejudice. It's not based on actual facts.
Was there a question in there?
I'll tell you.
I think it was a comment.
Too long.
And there's a comment over here as well. Question. This gentleman. Yeah, right. I'm counting my steps.
She might not be able to hear anyway, so if you just tell me, I'm going to have to tell her.
Yeah, I can't understand her.
Testing 1 2. I'm curious about your sister that had the mental breakdown and how she may have recovered from that experience and how that might have had a lasting impact on her as like her really trying to think, like her opportunity for success in life. Like, did that have a lasting impact?
So he's asking about Auntie Mickey. I'll answer a little bit of that question. So when I first heard some of this story, it really hit me because I recognize all these characteristics in my aunt. She was 16 at the time. I've heard stories that her and her sisters, who were teenagers, would wait until like 2 a.m. when the bathrooms and showers were clear before they would go in there because, their bodies were changing and so forth, and they didn't want to go shower in front of everybody. And so it was difficult for them. Also, my Auntie Mickey, in particular, was the last oldest sibling left in camp. By the time, as the war progressed, some of the older siblings were able to get jobs. That's how one of the ways you could get out of camp early was to get a job. Served like my uncle volunteered for the Army. My aunt was a secretary working in the base where one of the uncles was stationed and so forth. She was the oldest one left when the camp closed. And she was the one that was responsible for taking the family, the 2 parents who didn't speak English, and all the however many younger siblings left, 4 or 5 younger siblings, on the train with 2 transfers all the way to Minnesota. And she recounts just being a nervous wreck having to do that. She was so stressed out, and that was one of the times in that her therapist later mentioned that that was one of the triggering incidents right there.
Yes.
Anything else you want to add about Auntie Mickey?
No, there's a question over here as well. Excuse me?
I just thought I'd mention that I have a book. It's called Order, I think it's 9066, that was produced by, I think, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's a book of pictures, and it is extremely powerful of the camps. So I don't know if anybody's seen
It's
that.
called Order 9066, a book of pictures.
Yeah, picture. It was an exhibit that the MoMA put on.
You may have said this and I missed it, but in the map that you showed of the camp that you were in the little square down in the right-hand corner of each block, how many people were in each block? And do you know what the population was of your camp?
Do you know the population? What was the population of each block? And what was the population of the entire camp?
The estimated population of each block was between 250 to 300 people living in each block.
And the entire camp of Minidoka?
Well, yes, as I said, all of the 10 camps were physically designed in the same way. So that would be true of, of the other camps.
Do you know how many in the camp?
Oh, altogether, how many of us were in Minidoka? I don't know the exact number. It's a little over 10,000.
Oh, okay.
I think at one time we were the 3rd largest city in Idaho.
Wow.
Okay, excuse me. Yep, I'm going to go this way. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful comments. I'm very curious about the other people in the family. You, the son, have indicated that you never heard conversations like this when you were growing up. And here you are now, both of you, sharing these stories so publicly. Has anyone else in the family of either generation chosen to speak out? And how have other people in the family responded to what the two of you are doing so bravely and so beautifully?
She wants to know, have any of your other siblings spoken out about this issue? And has there been a reaction to what you have been doing?
Have my other siblings spoken out about the issue? I have to honestly say no. I mean, even when I went to talk to some of the older ones, trying to get some of their stories, you know, their standard answer to me would be, I don't remember. And I think that was just intentional. To me, it was probably because it was too painful to bring up.
And what about in the younger generation? Are you the only one speaking out in your
No, there are several others of my generation who do this kind of thing. I would say, for my part, I've been listening to my mother give this speech for a number of years, and I've always thought, well, that's a terrible thing that happened in the past. You know, hopefully it won't happen again. And now that I see these things developing over the past 10 years, it's been very alarming to me. I'm very heartbroken that she's lived to see the day now where this is an issue. After all the years she spent talking about this and warning people what can happen when you allow the government to start encroaching on people's civil rights. To protect yourself, you're willing to give away the rights of others. How dangerous that can be. For my generation, I think, my cousin is here as well, I don't know if you would agree with me, but we kind of blissfully lived through our youth without kind of ignoring this issue a little bit. When my kids would tell me that I was whitewashed, you know, so to speak, when we were living in the United States, our parents wanted us to be Americans. So, you know, I could tell you, you know, about Vikings players and Twins players of the 70s, but I probably couldn't tell you my mother's story during that time. Since I've been watching her do the talk and I've learned more about it, I've come to know more and had more time to reflect on it.
We have another question over here.
Yes.
I was wondering about, while living in these camps, how practicing religion was like.
What was it like to practice religion in camp?
What was it like to practice religion? Well, in the beginning, only the Christian religion was allowed. As I mentioned, many of the Buddhist priests were amongst those that were rounded up and taken into these Department of Justice prison camps. I'm not sure exactly when they were allowed to start having Buddhist services, but it did come to a point where eventually they could conduct Buddhist services. And especially many of the men who died on the battlefield and were practicing Buddhists wanted to be buried as a Buddhist. And so they allowed them to have a Buddhist funeral.
Hello. I have read George Takei's autobiography, and he had several examples of like the surrounding like situation, like the entire camp surrounded by barbed wire fence with large posts with soldiers pointing their guns inward. And I was wondering, was your camp the same way, or did like any similar things like that happen?
So he's read about the camps being surrounded by barbed wire with soldiers with guns pointing in. And he wants to know, was that what your camp was like, and what was that like?
Yes, it is true. All the camps were surrounded by barbed wire. The maximum security camp at Tule Lake was surrounded by 2 rings of barbed wire, one of which was electrified. But ours was just regular barbed wire. And then we had between 6 to 8 guard towers around the perimeter of the camp with, soldiers manning each one with their rifles up in the guard towers, and those guns always being pointed at us. The camp at Tule Lake had, I believe, over 20 of those watchtowers around the perimeter. That's how much more secure they made that camp.
Got another question right here. We'll go here first.
I guess I just thought about this when you had brought up the guard towers, and I was wondering what that experience was like within, like, the camps? Like, did you have interactions with the guards? Did you, like, I'm kind of wondering what that dynamic was like, if there was one at all.
She wants to know more about what it was like to have the guards. Did you ever interact with any of the guards? Did anybody
What
talk
was
to
it
them?
like to be guarded all the time?
Did you ever interact with them? Did you ever talk to them?
Was there, if there was any kind
They
of dynamic?
definitely did not interact with the rest of us. They kept totally separate. They were very businesslike.
Okay,
So, you know, it wasn't like we're on a friendly basis or anything like that. No.
Okay, thank you very much.
They knew they had a job to do, and they were doing their job.
Thank you.
In fact, you know, I often wondered, were those National Guards in those towers? So I just had to look that up recently to make sure that they were not using the National Guards like that. Those were military police.
I would assume that the families living in such close quarters get to be quite a close-knit community over time. And I'm wondering what kind of celebrations you might have had for births, weddings, funerals, what elements of community brought you together as Japanese interred so closely in these buildings.
Are you asking about celebrations in the camps?
Yes, yes.
Okay, well, you know, I was there, as I said, for 3.5 years. We never celebrated my birthday. Okay, I did not get any Christmas presents. One of the things we did have was a Easter egg hunt. You know, where they had wrapped one of the eggs in like a gold foil or something, and if you found that egg, you got a special prize, which was one of those big Hershey bars that breaks up into all these little pieces. And my brother Tom, you know, the one that was at the movies, he was on the committee that had the eggs. So he told my sister where to look for that golden egg, which was actually hid in the coal pile. But she got the golden egg, and then she, you know, at least shared her chocolate with all of us. Yeah.
She's asking
She
about
has
daily life.
daily life.
What was daily life like? Well, you know, for me as a child, it was just a matter of getting up, going. We had all our meals in that common mess hall, so going to eat and then going off to school. And then we would come back at lunchtime and then go back to school again for the afternoon. And then, you know, for me as a child, there was always a lot of other kids to play with. And of course, you know, we played outdoors most of the time because there wouldn't be enough room in your barracks to do much. In fact, the only thing we were allowed to bring in the way of a game or a toy when we left our homes was a deck of cards. And so I learned how to play a lot of card games. Yeah.
One story that I'm reminded of is that, so because it was a mess hall style eating, the kids would eat together with their friends. So it was like every meal, the kids were off somewhere eating with their friends, and one of the adverse effects of that is the family never sat down at the dinner table together. So the parents kind of lost their authority over their kids in terms of, you know, instilling their family values to them in that way. And my mother tells a story about when they moved eventually back to Minneapolis, her father, my grandfather, at night mumbling to himself, but I'm still head of this family, I'm still head of this family. Because, you know, the older brother had kind of taken over the financial aspect and everything. So that was one of the bad side effects of that situation.
We have a question here as well. And then this, one more question after this, and we're going to wrap it up so we can give them a chance. And thank you very much. Go ahead.
So I had an opportunity in the past year to see a play at the History Theater that was about over in St. Paul about the Japanese. I see you nodding your head. You know what I'm talking about.
We went to the play.
Okay,
We're
so you
talking
went
about-
to
yes.
this play, and I was so surprised to find out that there was a camp in Prior Lake that trained Japanese army or military folks. And did you connect with any of those folks when you eventually made it to Minnesota? I'm just curious what remnants of that were part of the culture here as well.
She's asking about a camp in Prior Lake.
I think, yeah.
Camp Savage in Prior Lake, where the soldiers trained. Did your family have any connections with those people?
Savage was actually the place that my brother Joe, that served in the military intelligence service, was sent when he came to Minnesota. That's where the military intelligence school started. But this facilities really were not large enough because they had over 6,000 people, like my brother, going through that school. And so by the second year, they moved to Fort Snelling, and that's where the school was until 1946.
I just wanted to close with one thought. Again, we are from the JACL, Japanese American Citizen League, and for years I would always focus on the J at the front, the Japanese part of it, but now I've been thinking more about the middle two letters, AC, American Citizen. I want to leave you with this last photo right here. This is a photo that's taken in Oakland, outside of a Japanese American grocery store on December 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor, and he put a big sign on the front of his store that said, I am an American. And I think this gets at the heart of the issue, because I think about what's happening now and about how how willing some people are to give away the civil liberties of others in order to make themselves feel safer, and how that can just lead to one thing after another, and how it's important for everybody to have a voice and to speak up when this happens. I think about the picture of the general who was talking about, we've got to wipe the Japanese off the face of the map. And I think about the meeting that our president had recently with his generals, and how he's looking for generals like that so that he can do what he wants, and how important it is to have people in the military of all different backgrounds, so that well, that's not true, because I serve with this gentleman right here, and I know that that's not true about him, how important that diversity is in the military. I know outside there's voter registration available for people. Is that true?
There is.
So,
yes.
It's important to vote. It's important to get involved. If there's anybody here who's not registered, I would encourage you to register to vote. And I want to thank you for having us tonight.
And we thank you. Standing ovation.
Thank you very much. You're much too kind. Thank you.
The lessons that you observed, we're living in that again, unfortunately, as you said. And I think we all have to pay attention, be strong, because people like you and your family were very strong, and we have to do the same thing. We have to be very strong and do what's right. The League, we support democracy, the Constitution, and the rule of law. Don't ever forget those three things. And thank you. And I want to also extend a special thanks to a friend of mine who's in the audience, whose mother was also in a concentration camp, and she didn't talk about it much. I know that. I asked her if she would want to say something. She said no, she didn't want to. But she is a very good person, and she is Japanese. So anyway, thank you so very much. It was wonderful. And I love the diversity in this audience. It's great. I mean, men, women, young, older, whatever. It's just wonderful. Thank you for being here, all of you. And good evening. Thank you.